African slavery began in the American colonies during the 17th century and ended in 1865. That's a lot of unpaid labor hours. From childhood to death, slaves toiled for the enrichment of masters and the wealth building that benefited their heirs. Sean Rochester, University of Chicago economist and author of The Black Tax, estimates that labor extracted from enslaved Africans from 1619 to 1865 would amount to from 24 to $97 trillion. Certainly, generation wealth for many somebodies, but not for descendants of the enslaved. Therefore, it would seem reasonable that after the Civil War, the remaining formerly enslaved deserved reparations for their labors until the end of their lives, knowing that they could never be repaid for slavery costs. Seems reasonable and fair. In the video, Slavery Pensions, I presented a brief history of the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association of the United States of America. They lobbied tirelessly across the country, established many chapters to recruit members, and orchestrate petition signing for submission to the Congress on behalf of the slave pension bill. Their request was patterned after what the government was paying Civil War veterans and widows. They proposed paying freed persons aged 70 and older a one time payment of $500 and $15 a month. Those 60 to 69 would receive $300 and $12 a month. Those aged 50 to 59 would receive $100 and $8 a month, and those under 50 would receive $4 a month for the rest of their life. Imagine how the lives of freed persons who had labored dawn to dusk could plan the rebuilding of independent lives. Walter R. Vaughan was born in Selma, Alabama, but he believed that pensions to former slaves would provide increased economic vitality and stability to the New South. In 1891, he published a pamphlet entitled Freedmen's Pension Bill, a plea for American freedmen, and he sold copies for $1. He collected information from freed persons about their lives after emancipation. In this advertisement, Negro preachers and teachers were asked to read the pamphlet to all freed persons and to send money orders for a gold emblem badge and Vaughn's new book. It was reported that Vaughan may have made out better advocating for ex slave pensions than organizations working for them. He claimed expenditures of $20,000, but the Commissioner of Pensions in 1899 estimated he collected $100,000 in revenues. While living in Omaha, Nebraska, Vaughan did persuade the Congressman William James Connell to introduce the ex slave pension bill to Congress in 1890. Otherwise, consideration for pensions may not have seen the light of day at all. Vaughn's work seems to have gone unchallenged by the federal government regarding his financial benefits from monies collected from freed persons, and others copied Vaughn's collection methods. But the American government acted against organizations led by Blacks who were doing the same, particularly the National Ex Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association of the United States of America, MRB and PA. which was one of the strongest voices advocating for pensions. It was chartered in 1897 in Nashville, Tennessee. They were well organized and lobbied Congress for favorable backing of pensions, with chapters throughout the South and Midwest. They boasted hundreds of thousands of members. The leaders were formerly enslaved Isaiah H. Dickerson and Callie D. House. They worked hard traveling around the country. As membership grew, government surveillance intensified. Unfortunately, Dickerson, House, and other association officers were unaware of government's intense planning to undermine slavery pension efforts. A campaign began to discourage freed persons from supporting these organizations, telling them not to contribute or join. In fact, there were unscrupulous people taking advantage of freed persons. Some say the failure of the Freedmen's Bank and loss of millions of dollars served as an example of money taking through mismanagement from formerly enslaved. Three federal agencies, the Bureau of Pensions, the Post Office Department, and the Department of Justice, worked collectively in the late 1890s and into the early 20th century to undermine organizations advocating slave pensions and their leaders. Some federal officials felt that pensioning freedmen was unrealistic and stated that the government had no intention of compensating them. Looking at these Americans who were eager to live life free during Reconstruction, wonder if they had a clue about the sinister dealings taking place at the highest levels of government. Henry Clay Evans, pension commissioner at the Bureau of Pensions, began an intense investigation of ex slave pension organizations and their officers, sending agents to attend meetings and conventions seeking incriminating evidence of fraud and violation of the law. They interviewed officers, they examined documents and talked to members. They distributed circulars warning of fraud. They found no evidence of any legal violation. But that did not prevent Evans from railing against organizations advocating for pensions. He reported that these organizations were guilty of arousing false reparation hopes for historical wrongs and inevitable disappointments that would stimulate distrust of the dominant race, whites, and of the United States government. Their law division continued to investigate toward building a case against organization officers and members representing themselves as appointees of the United States government. This failed because they found no evidence of fraud. The Bureau joined forces with the Post Office Department in the late 1890s to widen its search for fraudulent activity. United States Post Office. Their attacks focused on investigations of mail fraud and fraudulent solicitation. Harrison Barrett, the acting Assistant Attorney General for the Post Office Department, admitted in an 1899 circular that, quote, there has never been the remotest prospect that the bill would become a law, end quote. This statement exemplified the true intent of their investigations to disrupt passage of slave pensions. Interesting that I could not find a picture of Mr. Barrett on the internet. They used their powers to boost claims that these organizations were defrauding freedmen using the U.S. Postal Service. Barrett acted in 1899, issuing a fraud audit against the organization and national officers: Dickerson, Reverend D.D. McNary, Reverend N. Smith, Reverend H. Head, and Mrs. House. He forbid the delivery of all mail, including payments sent from members. The organization's mail was intercepted and returned to sender marked fraudulent, or they withheld delivery to the intended recipients. All this despite finding no evidence of wrongdoing against the organization. Postal Service decisions were often unreviewable by the courts. What could they do? The officers wrote letters to Barrett and the Nashville postmaster, invoking their First Amendment rights and citing their 14th and 15th Amendment rights, appealing to their consideration of the dire living conditions of many freedmen. They vehemently denied any wrongdoing. They hired an attorney to represent them. But the post office did not budge. Department of Justice. The MRB and PA turned to the Department of Justice to substantiate claims of honest and fair practices. They submitted a list of local agents in an effort to sow good faith actions and to establish organization credibility. But their efforts were dismissed. Next, they opened their books to examination and established a grievance committee for member complaints or concerns and to review questionable and disputed expenditures. They set strict consequences for evidence of misuse of funds. This was done not knowing that nothing would have made a difference because the government was intent on shutting down the pension movement. The pension bill was submitted to Congress but was not given any serious attention. The Senate Committee on Pensions examined S 1176 and wrote an adverse report. The report described freed people in the movement as ignorant and credulous freedmen, and the committee concluded that this measure is not deserving of serious consideration by Congress and recommended its indefinite postponement. Callie House was furious. She wrote to the Commissioner of Pensions reminding him of the purpose of this legislation and what was owed to freedmen. She cited the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. She wrote that the Constitution of the United States grants its citizens the privilege to petition Congress for a redress of grievances. Therefore, I can't see where we have violated any law whatsoever. However, in 1901, Dickerson was found guilty of swindling in an Atlanta, Georgia court. The press reported that he would have to pay a $1,000 fine or be sentenced to 1 year on the chain gang. The conviction was overturned later that year by the Georgia State Supreme Court, which reasoned that in order to be convicted of swindling, Dickerson would have had to have claimed that an ex slave pension bill had passed and become law, or that an appropriation had been made to pay pensions, and not simply that he was advocating for passage of pension legislation. Dickerson died in 1909, and Mrs. House became the organization's leader. In 1915, the association filed a class action lawsuit in federal court for a little over $68 million against the United States Treasury. The lawsuit claimed that this sum, collected between 1862 and 1868 as a cotton tax, was due the appellants because the cotton had been produced by them and their ancestors as a result of their involuntary servitude. Enter the United States Post Office again. Somebody had to stop Callie House. She was arrested and indicted on charges of mail fraud. She was accused of sending misleading circulars through the mail, guaranteeing pensions to association members, and profiting from the movement. She denied ever assuring members that the government would grant pensions or that a law had been passed providing pensions for ex slaves. There was also no evidence that she profited from the movement. However, in 1917, an all white male jury convicted her of mail fraud charges, and she was sentenced to a year in jail at the Missouri State Prison in Jefferson City. She was released from prison in August 1918, having served the majority of her sentence. This pretty much brought an end to the quest for slave pensions.